Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Waterstones virtual school event. Today, I am delighted to welcome Alice Roberts, who will be here to talk to you about her book Wolf Road, which is currently our children's book of the month. Wolf Road is an absolutely thrilling, adrenaline-filled, exhilarating tale of a girl living in the prehistoric times, and is one of those books where you pick it up and you just cannot stop reading, but you'll hear more about that from Alice in a moment. So Alice will be talking for about half an hour, and then we will be answering your questions. Thank you for submitting your questions in advance to everyone who has, but feel free to pop some questions in the chat and the Q&A as we go through, if anything else occurs to you. This session is being recorded, so don't worry if you miss anything. Your teachers will be emailed a link to it in a few days so you can revisit parts of it. And we'd love to see pictures of you enjoying the event. So if you would like to share any, please share them on social media using the hashtag Waterstones Virtual Events. That's it from me at the moment. I'll be popping up later to do the Q&A, but for now, over to you, Alice.
Thank you very much indeed, Rhiannon, and good morning, everybody, from Simon & Schuster HQ in London, where I've come in to see my lovely publishers, and then I'm joining you with, of course, Waterstones, and I'm so delighted to be Waterstones Book of the Month, and that's meant that Wolf Road has been in a lot of shop windows, and there's lots of lovely Wolf Road paraphernalia on the shelves behind me there. So my book is all about, as Rhiannon said, a girl in the Ice Age. So the Ice Age was very, very icy, a very, very long time ago. And I've done a lot of work researching it as a university researcher. And I thought it would be lovely to write a story. And one of my main motivations for writing this book was because I wanted to share some of what I was learning about the Ice Age with my own children. So in a big way, they helped me write my book as well. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now so I can show you some lovely pictures, starting with the lovely cover of Wolf Road, which was designed by a fantastic artist called Keith Robinson. He is prolific. That means he does lots and lots of art, and he you will be familiar with his work. He has illustrated so many books. One of my favorite books that he's illustrated is Dogs of the Deadlands. He did all the illustrations for that, but he's really helped bring my story alive. So in this picture, we can see my main character, Thule. She's 12 years old, and you can see that she's got what looks like a dog with her, but it's actually a wolf. And this is why the book is called Wolf Road. So this is all about the Ice Age. We're basically plunged back into the depths of the Ice Age. Now, the Ice Age is a very, very, very long time in Earth's history. It actually stretches from around 2.6 million years ago to around 12,000 years ago. And during that time, we've got most of human evolution happening. But also, actually, my story is set towards the end of the Ice Age. It's set about 30,000 years ago. And by that time, we've got modern humans. And by that, I mean the same species as us. So the people that we're talking about in my book are the same species as us. That species is called Homo sapiens. But they live a very different kind of lifestyle from us today. They're hunter-gatherers. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as well. But when I was thinking about how to write the book, I started off by thinking about what the landscape would have been like, but also actually the fact that there are these clues in our landscape, even in Britain, where you can see that ice has been present at one point in time, or at several points in time, in fact. So if you go up to the Highlands of Scotland, you see beautiful landscapes like this. And this big U-shaped valley is empty of ice today. There's a little river meandering its way through the landscape. But in the depths of the Ice Age, this would have been completely full of ice. There would have been a massive glacier flowing through these mountains. And in fact, it's the action of the ice, it's the action of that glacier that has carved out this valley. And this is what scientists started to realize in the 19th century. So about 200 years ago, they started to realize that the Earth had these big glaciations. So glaciation means a time when it's covered in ice. And of course, there are still some places that are largely covered in ice today. So you can go to places, you can go and visit places in the Arctic, which show you what most of Europe, in fact, would have been like during the Ice Age. So this is Greenland, and I was lucky enough to visit Greenland in the process of filming some of my BBC series. So I've made many programs for BBC and other channels. And I made a series quite a few years ago called Ice Age Giants, which is still on iPlayer, so you can catch it there. But we travelled to very far north places, both in Asia, so in Siberia, and in North America, and also to Greenland as well. And this is springtime in Greenland, so you can see there's still a bit of snow around, and there are icebergs rafting on the sea, and you can see a little town there on this tiny island. And we were staying near a glacier called the Store Glacier. And in fact, that is the sea ice just to the side of the Store Glacier. And that's our camp. So we're staying in a very remote place and having to camp. So we're dropped off by a helicopter, camping up on the cliff above the glacier and looking out over this landscape. And this is how landscapes in Europe would have looked during the Ice Age. So this is how places, for instance, in France and Spain might have looked during the Ice Age. Britain was largely covered by ice completely at the peak of the Ice Ages. So the ice sheet came down as far as the Thames River in the east and as far as the Severn River in the west. So if you're watching from somewhere that's north of there, so essentially, if you're watching from somewhere that's north of London, you would have been underneath probably a mile of ice, a massive ice sheet. And if you're joining me this morning from somewhere that's south of London, so perhaps someone like Kent in the east, or perhaps someone like Cornwall or Devon in the west, you would have been just south of the ice sheet, but still you would have been in tundra, so a treeless environment, very much like this environment up on the cliff here that you can see. So I'd visited these places as well and wanted to kind of bring my experiences of those landscapes into the story. If we look at how much ice there was covering the world during the peak of an ice age, so during that 2.6 million years, what we find is that the world isn't completely bound in ice all of the time. What we have is long periods of time when you've got a lot of ice around, and then brief periods, brief in geological terms, 10,000 years or so, every 100,000 years, the world warms up and becomes much greener again and much more like it is today. And then you're back into this period, which is very cold with extensive ice sheets. And just look at this map of the world. It looks quite familiar, but then when you actually look at it harder, you go, ooh, there's a lot of white over most of Northern Europe. And if you try and spot Britain on that map, you can't see it because it's under ice. And look how much ice there is coming right down over North America as well. So an awful lot of North America, all of Canada, and the northern half of what's now the United States, completely covered with ice. And so you've got people and animals forced to move south and living in areas which today are much warmer and kind of Mediterranean or even tropical in terms of their warmth. And then during the periods when we don't have the ice, they can move back into the north again. But as I said, I've set my story about 30,000 years ago, where the ice sheets aren't quite as extensive as they are here, but it's definitely a lot colder than today. So when I started writing the book, the first thing I did was to make the world. And so I thought about the landscape that there would have been, and I thought about what that landscape would have been like in terms of the plants and the animals that were in it. So in other words, I'm thinking about ecology. So ecology is the study of the environment, and that includes the climate globally, but also locally. And of course, that's going to determine what kind of plants and animals you've got in those areas. If you think about the kind of plants and animals that we have in Britain compared with the kind of plants and animals that you might find in sub-Saharan Africa today, there's a big difference. I mean, there's a big difference even between Britain and the kinds of plants and animals that you find around the Mediterranean as well. So in the Ice Age, if I'm thinking about setting this broadly in Europe and then thinking about the climate, the plants and the animals, the kind of plants and animals that there would have been, for instance, if I'm imagining it, that it might be set in what is modern day France, the kind of plants and animals that are gonna be there are the kinds of plants and animals that are in the Arctic today, and not just in the Arctic, but in the high Arctic, so very far north. So in terms of thinking about how my people, the characters in the story, were going to be living from a day-to-day basis, I thought about how people would survive in the Arctic today. And obviously people have a lot of modern technology now, but there are people who are still following old life ways or very ancient life ways, including herding reindeer. And so I included some of the insights from modern people living in the Arctic today in my story. And then I was also really, really keen to bring our knowledge of the past to life in the story. So there are different ways that we can understand the past. If we're talking about the last 2000 years, we have quite a lot of writing. So we have books, and we can read books, and we can read the words of people who are obviously no longer here, and we can understand about their lives. If we go back more than 2000 years ago, there is no writing. There's very little writing. There's certainly no writing in the places that I'm talking about. And going back 30,000 years ago, there's no writing anywhere. So this is way before writing, and that's what we term prehistory. So you've heard the term prehistory, prehistoric. Literally, it means before writing, before history, before the written word. So archaeology is the discipline that we can use to understand people's lives before history comes along. And what archaeology does is looks for traces of people, very often buried underground, as you might have seen in my series, Digging for Britain, which is coming back to BBC Two next year. And again, you can look at the previous series on iPlayer. But archaeology looks at the traces that people have left behind. So the culture that they had. So it might be things that they made. It might be buildings that they created. Now, going back 30,000 years ago, there weren't really any buildings. They would have been living in tents mainly. So you're looking at very, very subtle traces that are hard to find of people from that long ago. But there are other objects like stone tools that we can find that are durable and that remain in the ground. And so we can start to tell things about those people's lives. There's another thing that we've got now, another bit of science has come along to illuminate, to shed light on the deep past, and that is genetics. So we can use the study of DNA to help us today. We can use it to look at diseases, for instance, and to help us diagnose diseases. And doctors are using genetics more and more in terms of tackling diseases. We can also look at DNA to show us how we're related to each other. And you share half of your DNA with your parents, and a quarter of your DNA with your grandparents. So we can look at family connections through DNA as well. But we can also get DNA, not just from living people, but from ancient bones. So geneticists have got better and better at doing this, taking tiny samples from ancient bones and actually reading the DNA in it. And because we can do that, we can start to tell things about how people were moving around in the past. So we can track migrations, movements of people through the landscape. And we can also see what happens when different groups of people come together. And that was a real inspiration for my story, because we know that modern humans and another species of humans called Neanderthals did meet each other. And we know that because they not only met each other, they had children together. And we can see that in the DNA. And I thought, I want to think about that meeting, the first meeting between modern humans and Neanderthals, from the perspective of children. We often think about it from the perspective of adults. But of course, children were around in the past, just as they are today. In fact, if you looked at any population, there were more children as a proportion, as a fraction of the population in the past than there are today. So children were even more important in the past. So that was where the story began. So I start with all of that real archaeology, real science, real ecology, and then create a story that flows from that. Now I'm going to put this word up, and I think in your classrooms, I would like you to just spend a moment. I would like to see if your teachers can see a show of hands of how many students know what this is, and whether your teacher knows what it is as well. So tiger, that's how we pronounce it. I wonder how many of you know what tiger is. Put your hand up if you know what tiger is. And your teachers can have a quick look around the classroom. Some of you might be a bit nervous about putting your hand up, but put your hand up if you know what tiger is. I think your teachers might be surprised at how many of you do actually know what this is. And now I wonder if the reason that you know what it is the same reason that my son knew what it was. Because when I was writing the book, I said, I want to use this word, but I'm not sure if it's too complicated, too technical. Is it the kind of word that people are going to go, oh, what's that word mean? I think it's good to use words like this sometimes because we can go and look them up in a dictionary and then we learn something. But I didn't want it to be too technical. But my son said, oh, I know what that is. And I was quite surprised. I said, where have you heard that word then? And he said, Minecraft. So in Minecraft, you start off by choosing a biome. And a biome is an ecological zone, an eco zone. And you can choose lots of different eco zones that your world is going to grow. So you start with a world seed, and the world seed grows, and it's going to give you a particular kind of ecology. And one of the ecologies that you can choose is taiga. So I expect those of you that knew the word, some of you at least may have come across it in Minecraft. And so this is just an indication that Minecraft can be a brilliant educational tool. And here it is. So taiga is a snowy forest, and it's quite a sparse forest. But there's a lovely snowy forest in Minecraft, and here's a real one. So this is what real taiga looks like. And again, this is from one of my trips to the far north, to the Arctic, to Siberia. This is what it looks like down on the ground. So this is the kind of taiga which has spruces and larches. So these are larch trees. It's very, very beautiful in the depths of winter like this, where they're all loaded up with glittering snow. And I wanted to get some of that beauty into my book as well. Now, that taiga in the summertime is going to be green. So the snow melts and we've got summer. So even though I'm talking about the Ice Age in my book, and the depths of the Ice Age 30,000 years ago, there would have been summertime, and there would have been times when everything got nice and green like this and the snow melted. The big difference, though, between then and now is that the summer is really quick, and we still see that in the Arctic today. So we'll see that winter is much, much longer than the winter that we experience in Britain, for instance, and it goes on for about 9 months of the year. And then you've got a very quick spring, very quick summer when everything grows like crazy. All the plants are growing like crazy. Any of the animals in this environment are going to be eating themselves crazy. I mean, they're just eating so much because they have to. This is when they've got lots and lots and lots of opportunity to get fat, to eat plants, and then they'll be all right through the winter. And the humans have to do exactly the same as well. So there we go. We have a brief summertime. And in the course of my journey in the book in Wolf Road, I go from the end of winter. So it starts off in a very snowy place, and then people are migrating, moving along a river. And by the time they get to the river mouth, it is almost summertime. I was really, really lucky, as I've already said, when I wrote Wolf Road to work with this amazing illustrator. This is Keith. And there we are in Salisbury when the book was first published last year. And as you can see, he's done a wonderful picture on the window of this bookshop in Salisbury. And he really did bring the book to life for me. Inside the book, he's done these beautiful black and white pictures, and they are charcoal drawings. So that might be something you want to have a go at. You may have used some charcoal before. It's a really, really brilliant sort of medium to use in art. You can smudge it with your fingers and you can get this lovely impression of sunlight coming through trees, as we can see in that picture with the deer. And then you can use the edge of the charcoal to get some quite fine lines. I mean, look at that deer. There's a passage in the book where Tuli and her cousin Wren come across a deer, and it startles and it stands there. And you can see this deer. I've described it in the book with the sunlight shining through its ears, so they're translucent. And Keith has captured that so, so beautifully in this picture, I think. Very, very clever use of charcoal. Might be something that you want to have a go at. And then we can see another picture that Keith has done where he's used the contrast of the black charcoal and the white paper to give us that impression of this snowy landscape. And you can see some wolves coming through the taiga in this picture. Here's another beautiful picture by Keith. And this is as my people in the story get to the end of their migration, where they're going to spend about a month camped by the seaside, camped by the estuary. And when they do this, they come together with lots of other tribes. So the tribe itself, the Talo, which is a Finnish word for tribe, is about 20 to 30 people. And then when they come together, at summer camp, they're meeting up with lots and lots of other tribes. So I think there would have been a real festival atmosphere. We can imagine flags fluttering in the breeze. And you can see these beautiful fulmars, again, with the sun shining through their wings, circling over my little band of hunter-gatherers as they approach summer camp. And they're all excited about getting to the summer camp. It's like going to Glastonbury. So the landscape is full of incredible animals. There are lots of incredible animals in this book. The Ice Age is a time of we often call it the golden age of mammals. There were big mammals everywhere, lots of whom are now extinct. So we have things like steppe bison, which was there right across Europe and Asia and is related to the bison that are still in North America. We know that our ancestors saw these animals because they painted them, and sometimes they even made sculptures of them. And this is a beautiful, beautiful ivory bison sculpture that I held. So these are my hands, and I'm holding this ivory bison. And this is from a site in Russia called Zaraisk. And that bison is about 20,000 years old. Isn't that incredible? The archaeologists who found it said they thought it was used in hunting rituals and that it was a kind of magic item. And I said to them, do you think it was a toy? And I wasn't being flippant, because I think it's probably more likely that it was a toy. I think it's something that somebody made for a child. We see lots of figurines like this in our culture today, and most of them are toys, if you think about it. If you were to look through a rubbish tip and find something that was made out of plastic, it would probably be plastic, wouldn't it, rather than ivory today? And you found something like this, you wouldn't immediately think this is a ritual, magical object. You'd think it's a toy. So that's something else to think about and maybe discuss in your classrooms. Here's a cave bear. So there were bears around in Britain. They were huge. They were bigger than brown bears, although we know from studies of their teeth, we can analyze the chemicals in their teeth. We know that they were actually vegetarian. Still, I'd have been a bit scared of that bear. Look, he weighs 1,000 kilograms. He weighs a ton. I wouldn't want to stand in his way. Other animals roamed the landscape, like giant deer. They're much, much bigger than even the biggest red deer stag that we see in Britain today, with enormous antlers. And of course, huge animals like the iconic woolly mammoth. How amazing it would have been to see these animals. Now, the people in my story would have been very familiar with these animals. There would have been plenty of animals in the landscape they were living in. And if you want to see some brought back to life, as I said, my series Ice Age Giants is over on the iPlayer, and we looked at saber-toothed cats, we looked at cave bears, and then looked at mammoths and closely related mastodons over in North America as well. Now, one of the animals that was very, very numerous, there were lots of them during the Ice Age, and they're still around today, they're not extinct, of course, are reindeer. Now, there are fewer reindeer today than there were back in the Ice Age, because reindeer are very well adapted through evolution to cold, snowy landscapes. And those cold, snowy landscapes are much smaller today, so they're just restricted to the Arctic. So reindeer really are creatures of the Arctic, although occasionally you will see them coming a bit further south around Christmas time, of course. So there are reindeers in snow in Siberia. And essentially the journey that my people take in the book goes from winter camp, which is over on the right-hand side of this picture, in the east, in other words, where they're tucked away in the mountains and away from the cold, biting winds. So there would have been very, very strong winds, and they need to get away from those winds. And then over the course of the spring, they migrate, they move from east to west. And essentially what they're doing is following the reindeer. So the reindeer would have been doing the same thing. They would have been hiding out inland in the winter and then moving to the estuary in the west. As you can see, there's Somerset in the west. And the reindeer are moving there to eat all the grasses and sedges and reeds around the estuary in the summer. And then when autumn or leaf fall happens, they start to move back east again. So a really big difference between these people and us today is that they were always on the move. I mean, they might have stayed put for maybe a few weeks in summertime, but the rest of the time they're basically on the move. They're having to move to find food all the time. And so for the large amount of time that our ancestors were alive on the planet, so, you know, thousands and thousands of years, people were nomads and hunters. It's only very recently in the scheme of things that people have become farmers, really only in the last 10,000 years. And it's even more recently than that that people have stayed put. So we tend to stay put. We tend to stay in the same house, don't we, all year round? And that would have been very, very unusual for these ancestors. They would have thought that's a really weird thing to do. And I think they would have felt a bit itchy. They would have felt, oh, I don't want to stay put. I'm ready to move on to the next place. Now, have a think about it. If you're constantly on the move, what are you going to take with you? You are going to strip down what you need. And maybe that's something else that you could think about. If you were going to be a nomad, what would you take with you? Because you've got to carry everything. These people didn't have any domesticated animals. We haven't got to that point in human history. So they don't have any horses or cattle to carry things for them. They don't even have any domesticated dogs that could help pull things along. So they're carrying everything themselves. So if you had to carry everything yourself, what are the essential things that you would take with you in order to survive? That's an interesting question. Here's a lovely painting by the wonderful paleo artist, my friend Tom Bjorkland. And he didn't paint this to be Thule, but it could be her. So the main character in my book is called Thule. And she and her people would have been much darker skinned than most people in Europe today. So we know that people in Europe going back 20, 30,000 years ago had quite dark skin, actually. And it was only much, much later in the last few thousand years that pale skin started to evolve in some people. And those are insights, again, that we've got from genetics. So we can tell that by looking at DNA. But there she is. And she's obviously in winter time, she's wearing a big, thick, furry coat. And you can see that she's got some spears strapped to her back. She's making these spears. She can make them herself. She's very, very good at hunting, is Thule. And she's very, very good at making things out of flint. And she basically starts at the beginning of the story thinking that she's 12. She knows everything about the world and how the world works. And one of the points of the book is that she doesn't. And there's a big surprise waiting for her. So she and her people would have lived in temporary tents along the way. Probably not even as robust as this one. So this was one that was I was helping to make with some reindeer herders in Siberia on one of my visits when I was filming there. And you can see that it looks like what we might call a teepee, but that's actually an American word. It's a word from Native Americans. In Siberia, they tend to call them chums, chums. So this is a chum. It's very similar to a teepee. And the people all around the Arctic have very, very similar culture. And it's covered with skins, or you might cover it a bit with snow, I suppose, or you might, in the summertime, you might cover it with things like leaves. They would have probably used even less formal tents as well, this kind of thing. And I expect some of you have made things like this. It's fun to make dens in the woods, but back in the Ice Age, it would have been part of how you survived. So the next time you're making a den, have a think about that. What would it be like to make something which is going to keep you safe and dry and warm through the night? And maybe you could even try sleeping in one. You might need an adult with you to do that. This was from another one of my trips to the Arctic. You can see the tombs. Can you spot them? You can spot them just down there. There's what look like sheep or something down there as well. They're not. They're the sledges which are all packed up for the summer. So those have got all their winter things packed up for the summer. And this is springtime in the Arctic. And as you can see, there's still a lot of ice rafting on the river. Now, this is interesting. When you get close to these teepees, these tombs, they look quite old-fashioned, but they're not, because they've all got satellite dishes. And inside, they all had televisions. And most of them had either an Xbox or a PlayStation as well. So these are modern people. They're people living this way today. They're still reindeer herders. But they have a lot of the modern technology that we have as well. They have the internet, they have television, they enjoy watching films, and they like playing video games. So they have got these aspects of modern life, but they're still living as reindeer herders and reindeer hunters as well. So the aspects of that herding and hunting give us a bit of an insight into how people were living in the past, but we mustn't think that these people are frozen in time. They're not. They're modern people just like us. And here are some of them from one of my visits this was with the Evenki people of Siberia. And I put this slide up recently and asked some students who they thought the leader of this tribe was. So again, I'm just going to leave that up a second and ask your teachers if I don't know if you can, I don't know if you can look at the screen and kind of point to who you think the leader is, or suggest who you think the leader is. You can see me, I'm wearing the blue coat. But there are some of my team there, some of my crew from the BBC, and then a lot of Evenki people. So this is a small tribe of Evenki people. Who do you think the leader is in that picture? Have a little look at that, have a think about it. Who's the leader going to be? You might have a look at what they're wearing, maybe. You might have a look at how old they are. You can see some kids sitting on the floor at the front. And they're wearing their lovely furry hats to keep their ears nice and warm. So now you've had a little look at that. If you pointed to the person in the red coat, you were right. So the person in the red coat is a woman, and she's called Marina, and she was the leader of those reindeer herders. So I think sometimes we always assume it's going to be a man. Not at all. Traditionally, in the Arctic and amongst the Evenki, it's the women who are in charge of the tribes, and that is the case in my book as well. So as I said, the book's based on real archaeology and real archaeological objects. So a lot of the things that Thule and her friends are looking at or making in the book are based on real objects that you can go and see in museums. One of those real objects is a scallop shell. So a shell which has been pierced, so it can be worn as a necklace, a little bit like my necklace today, which is made of a coin, actually, not a shell. Should have worn a shell. And it's also been painted. And my friend, the archaeologist João Zilão, who works in Spain, has found shells like this from sites which are modern human sites, but also from sites which are older Neanderthal sites. And here we've got one shell which dates to about 20,000 years ago, which was made by modern humans. That's the small one. And one shell which was made about 50,000 years ago by Neanderthals. That's the larger one. And for a very long time, even before we had the genetic evidence that modern humans and Neanderthals met each other, Zhao had been arguing that they must have met because there are these bits of culture which seem so similar. And who knows, maybe even Neanderthals taught modern humans how to paint. It's a possibility. We know that they had nice culture like our own. This is a fantastic archaeological site deep in a cave called Brunekel Cave in France. And it's a ring of stalactites. And we don't really know what it's for, but we know that Neanderthals made it. And there's a passage in my book where the children go into a cave and they find a ring of stalactites. And again, a wonderfully evocative, beautiful picture by Keith Robinson, which just makes you feel like you're in the cave with the children as they're exploring. Now, it's called Wolf Road, so of course there are wolves in it. And we know that wolves were domesticated by humans. Now, maybe that makes it sound as though humans always chose to go out there and get wolves and domesticate them and make them into dogs. Sometimes I think it was the wolves getting friendly and approaching humans. But in the book, I use that knowledge that we have that wolves became dogs to create this friendship between Thule and a wolf pup, who she names Lupa. And I've set the story 30,000 years ago, and that is when we think the first wolves were domesticated. So I told you when farming started. Farming started 10,000 years ago. My book is set 30,000 years ago. So dogs are our oldest best friends. Dogs were domesticated from wolves thousands and thousands of years before cattle were domesticated. Pigs, sheep, goats, that all came much, much later. That all happened after 10,000 years ago. So dogs have been with us for a very, very long time. And I really wanted to capture that friendship between humans and wolves becoming dogs in the book. This picture by Tom Bjorklund feels to me like the beginning of my story. When the ice is melting, the river is starting to become free of ice, and the people know it's time to start moving again. The reindeer are also moving. They're getting a bit restless. And so the reindeer are starting to move off down the river. and the people are going to follow them. And so this really takes us to the start of Wolf Road. And I'm just going to leave you with this beautiful image by Keith Robinson. And this is Thule anticipating the adventure. So she's climbed up onto the cliff. She's looking down. Her camp is just tucked below her in this picture. And she's looking down and looking out across this river. And she knows that she's now headed towards spring camp and then onwards to summer camp. And she's looking forward to seeing all her friends. But she doesn't have a clue of the amazing adventure that she's about to embark on. So I'm going to stop at that point and I'll stop screen sharing and I'm going to hand back over to my friend Rhiannon at Waterstones.
Oh, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Alice. Could watch that for hours. I also feel like I could do with some Arctic weather at the moment. Melting in my office down here.
It's quite warm. It's much warmer than it ever would have been for Thule. She would have never experienced temperatures this high. I think probably in the summertime it might have got up to just above 10 degrees, but it wouldn't
really? Wow.
temperatures that it gets up to now. Having said that, in the summer in Siberia, it does get quite warm actually. You do get
really?
you do get blasts of heat which are quite warm, but it's very, very brief.
Yeah, and then it's gone. Well, thank you everyone for submitting all of your questions. I'm going to get to as many as we can. So firstly, we have a nice question from the Altrincham Church of England Primary School in Altrincham, who ask, when you wrote Wolf Road, what was more important to you, the story or the facts?
Oh, that's such a brilliant question, and both together. Because I wanted it to be real. So it's not a fantasy book. There's no real magic in it, although some people do believe in magic. So I wanted to explore that because sometimes I think we think that everybody in the past was very superstitious and believed in all sorts of magical things. But if you think about people today, then there are some people who do believe in magic. There are some people who believe in fairies. There are some people who are very religious and some people who are not religious. And I think it would have been just the same in the past. So although I haven't got any magic in the book, it is it is a real story, but it is a story. I've got all sorts of different people. So there are some people who do believe in magic. Thule's aunt is a shaman for the group. But Thule's dad, on the other hand, is very down to earth. And he doesn't believe in any of it. He just thinks the world is a natural place. And I think there would have been people like that at all times in history and prehistory as well. It's quite interesting to think about. We often see signs of people being religious in the past, and then we jump to the conclusion, or or superstitious, and we jump to the conclusion that everybody was like that. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think people would have been just as different as they are today, and just as thoughtful.
I've never actually thought of it like that. That's a really good way to frame it. Then we have a question from the Harrytown Catholic High School in Stockport. How did you find the time to write a book alongside all of your other commitments?
I love writing. It's something for me which started off as a kind of hobby, really, actually. So, I mean, I started writing this book not even realizing it was going to end up being a book. And I was writing it for my children, and I was enjoying reading it to them at bedtime. And I was writing, I was writing it to them as I was reading it to them as I was writing it. So I'd read them a chapter, and then they'd be going, oh, what happens next? And I had to say, I don't know. Right, I've got to write the next bit. But no, I really love writing. So I quite often write in the evening. But I have an interesting job which involves lots of different things. I work at the University of Birmingham, and I teach anatomy to medical students. That's the structure of the human body. And I also make television programs. And even when I'm making television programs, sometimes in the evenings I will sit down and do a little bit of writing. And then other days I'm largely spending my time writing. So yeah, I feel really lucky. And I think that when you're thinking about what you want to do in your life, you don't need to panic about it. You don't need to make up your mind anytime soon. But I would say, do the things you enjoy. And if you can end up doing a job that you enjoy doing, then that's fantastic. I mean, I love the things I do. I feel very lucky. But I would encourage you to kind of follow your passions. If there's something that you really, really love doing, try and make that into what you do for a job.
Excellent advice. Kind of similar to that, or on that theme, a question from Halberton Primary School in Tiverton asks, do you have any tips for children who want to become authors?
Yeah, absolutely. Reading. And it's for anyone that wants to become an author. So the way that you get better at writing is by reading, and by reading widely. So there'll be books that you really enjoy, and there'll be other books that you pick up and think, oh, I'm not sure about this. But I would, follow your teacher's recommendations as well. Read factual books, read fiction books, read books about all sorts of different subjects and by all sorts of different authors, and you'll find that people have different ways of writing, and you learn an awful lot, and it's the best way to improve your vocabulary as well. I mean, you can sit down with a dictionary and look at the words, learn the words in a dictionary, or sit down with a list of words. That's not a fun way to learn. We all learn better when we're looking at stories, when we're hearing stories or reading stories. So just read as much as you can, and then just do
Yeah,
it. Start writing stories.
absolutely. Cracking advice there. Again, kind of on that theme, the Teignmouth Primary School in Devon asks, who is your favourite author?
Oh, that's a really tricky one, and it probably changes. It changes all the time. And I have different authors in different genres. So I think one of my favorite fiction authors is Tracy Chevalier, who writes a lot of historical novels. So she does that thing where she starts with real history and real events, and then writes a story about it. She wrote a beautiful story about Mary Anning, the fossil collector in Lyme Regis, called Remarkable Creatures. That's one of my favorite books. And then I also really like Robert Macfarlane. He writes more factual books, but they're very, very beautifully written. And he's written some fantastic books about mountains, about the landscape, and also he collects lots of words that people use to describe landscape all over Britain. And then he's worked with the fantastic singer-songwriter and actor Johnny Flynn to do a beautiful album as well. So he does poetry that kind of then leads into music. And he writes children's books as well. So there's the beautiful Lost Words, which is by Robert Macfarlane, which is fantastic. So there's two very different authors that are two of my favourites.
Excellent. We have a lovely question from the Broadstone First School in Dorset, who asks, we are starting middle school in September. How can we be brave like Thule?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Thule is brave, but she does doubt herself as well. So she has worries about whether what she's doing is the right thing, and she does think very carefully about what she's doing in her life, and she thinks about the kind of impacts that it will have on other people. But she is really kind of brave and courageous, and maybe, I don't know, maybe reading the book helps you to think about being brave and courageous, but not taking too many risks.
I think what kind of stands out about Thule is that she's always very she's always following what she thinks is the right thing to do. So I think
Yes,
that's
it does.
good
Yeah.
behavior to model on.
Yeah, she thinks quite carefully about it, and also she's very, very thoughtful. Yeah.
Mm. Lots of people have asked this. The most recent person is Ringstead Primary School. They want to know, what is your favourite part of the book and why?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, I think it's probably the moment that Thule meets this extraordinary person. So she meets a boy called Andar, who's very different from anybody that she's ever met before. And it's probably the most dramatic bit in the book. And it's the moment where everything changes. And I always like that moment in a book where everything's been kind of going along, and it's interesting and the story's flowing, and then suddenly you just get a moment where everything twists. So for me it is that moment.
Excellent. We've got time for one more question. Thank you, everyone, for all of your enthusiasm. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. But St. Patrick's Cleartor Moore asks, will there be a sequel? We have just finished Wolf Road and are desperate to know what Thule's next adventure will be.
And I can say a resounding yes. And
Yay!
I have nearly finished writing it. So I think it's going to be published probably early next year. So keep an eye out for it. Provisionally, and this is, am I allowed to say this? Provisional title. It's a working title. It's going to be called Wolf Mountain. So it's a bit of a different
Ooh.
landscape that's being explored. So yeah, the Wolf Road ends with Thule thinking of going off on another adventure, and Wolf Mountain takes her off on, yeah. It's a bit of a wild ride, and I've nearly finished writing it. Keith is just starting to work on the illustrations. I've got Keith working on it again, which is absolutely
Oh,
amazing.
wow.
We've been able to get through quite a lot of questions. We haven't been able to get through everybody's questions, but I'm with Simon and Schuster in London today, and with Waterstones. We're going to be traveling around. We're going to be visiting bookshops, signing books and things. But I'm also going to be on Twitter. I'll be keeping an eye on Twitter. I still call it Twitter. You know, it's the thing which is meant to be called X.
Always going to be Twitter.
I'm at the Alice Roberts, and if any teachers have got any questions, any burning questions which kids wanted to ask me today, stick them on Twitter and I'll try and answer them while I'm going around and doing book signing.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for your thousands of questions. Please do get in touch if you have any others, and also share some pictures of you enjoying the event. We'd love to see them. A massive thank you to you, Alice, for such a fascinating morning. A reminder that Wolf Road is available in all good bookshops, but particularly Waterstones. We have some really lovely special editions, as it is currently our children's book of the month. That's all from us today. Have a lovely rest of your day and see you next time.